I'm going to tell a story from a period in the United States that was also characterized, well, that was characterized by crises, even if not war. So in the 1973 children's story, What Are We Going to Do, Michael? 10-year-old Michael, whom you see here, together with his neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, helps to save an 80-year-old southern magnolia in there that is threatened to be cut down to make way for an urban renewal project in their neighborhood. And we're in the United States, in New York City, and more specifically in Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant. Nellie Burkhardt, who's the author of this story, so Nellie Burkhardt's story based upon true facts and events that occurred in Brooklyn's Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Yet the way in which Burkhardt portrays Michael and Mrs. Jacobson belies parts of the true story. In the children's book, the two protagonists appear as white residents of a rundown, racially diverse neighborhood. In reality, Mrs. Jacobson was Hetty Carson, here she is, an African-American woman in her 70s living on a deteriorating neighborhood block in Bedford-Stuyvesant. It is unclear whether Burkhardt's choice to change the race of her protagonists had anything to do with the sales or readership aspirations for the book, or with the more idealist educational and egalitarian aspirations to cultivate white children's empathy and awareness of nature in the city and its ethnically and racially diverse citizenry, or in turn, even with an unabashed racism. In any case, the choice of the story itself, as well as the changes made to its principal characters, reflect the social concerns and anxieties of the time. But changing the race of the principal characters, while perhaps making the story more accessible to the anticipated majority of readers, also covered up one of the most important facts about it. By rallying for the protection of the southern magnolia, successfully saving it, and also the three historic brownstone buildings behind it, and by founding and running the so-called Neighborhood Tree Corps, for the planting and maintenance of neighborhood street trees, African-American citizens of Bedford-Stuyvesant turned trees into a means of empowerment and emancipation within the civil rights movement. The planting, maintenance, and conservation of trees became a grassroots initiative of Bedford-Stuyvesant's African-American citizens to assert their rights to the city and to its spaces in general. Tree planting and plant-ins became their tool of community building, as well as a civil right that could be used against ghettoization. Hetty Carson assumed her leadership position spontaneously in 1964, the first year of the civil rights riots in Bedford-Stuyvesant. The riots were in response to the shooting of a 15-year-old African-American by a police officer. They exacerbated a situation that Carson had long been observing. Many streets had turned from safe, tree-lined havens into rat-infested slums littered with trash. To alleviate the situation in 1964, Carson, together with 7 neighbors, formed a block association, and by gearing its activities towards the planting of trees, Carson responded to the lack of trees in the neighborhood. The association's modest beginnings consisted of a first fundraising event that brought in money to buy 4 trees. In 1966, a visit by Mayor Lindsay to the association's fundraising barbecue finally brought the necessary attention and publicity, leading to the implementation of the tree matching program. And this was a program that the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation put on, and what it meant was that for every 4 trees that a block association planted, it would receive 6 additional ones from the city. By 1970, almost 100 block associations had been formed, and more than 1,500 ginkgo, sycamore, and honey locust trees had been planted in Bedford-Stuyvesant, species that were resilient and adaptive to urban environments. In 1971, Carson and the members of the Bedford-Stuyvesant Beautification Committee were able to turn the tree planting initiatives into opportunities to teach young people in the neighborhood about nature. The neighborhood tree corps, as it was called, consisted of up to 30 children between 9 and 16 years old who attended classes on tree care and gardening, cared for the community's street trees, and in return received a modest stipend. And what is important actually about this initiative is also to note that they didn't just get the water from the water hydrants along the streets, but they had to intentionally knock on neighbors' doors in order to fill their buckets, in order to initiate and promote communication amongst neighbors. On multiple levels, tree planting had become a key tool of neighborhood transformation. Fittingly, the founding motto of an environmental center, which was called the Magnolia Tree Earth Center, was save a tree, save a neighborhood. Carson's project was tangible and direct, and it was started by someone who actually lived in the spaces that were in need of attention and transformation. Tree planting was a creative and constructive activity that could, its initiators certainly hoped, replace the neighborhood's more common hostility and alienation. It had immediate aesthetic and spatial impact, and it could be carried out by the citizens directly. While based upon intrinsic values that were implicit in the planting activities themselves, like neighborhood improvement, nature education, community building, and mutual social support, the tree plantings were also representational. One of the things distinguishing the tree planting activities from other civil rights initiatives, therefore, was not only their grassroots do-it-yourself and self-help character, but their aesthetic. Trees made a difference in a visual and spatial sense, as well as in the more ephemeral atmospheric sense that includes their ability to change the microclimate. Trees could fill the visual and phenomenological gap between top-down policies and the actual experience in the rundown neighborhood. Tree planting left a tangible result and made the neighborhood look and feel different. It could give the neighborhood a new identity while at the same time recognizing that the street had been and could be a community social space. It was this aesthetic and representational aspect of the tree planting campaigns that complemented, if not to a certain extent even countered, federal programs like the Model Cities program of the time that was directed towards rehabilitating the inner city and modernizing its fabric. And indeed, Carson's campaign to save the southern magnolia that you see in these two images, and that is in fact still standing, meant that the initial design for a new model city's development in the area had to be altered so that the tree and its three sheltering brownstone buildings could ultimately be preserved. In the battle for the southern magnolia's protection, the unique physical character traits of its neighborhood stood against the unifying and standardized designs of the Model Cities program. The time when Hetty Carson began her project was ripe with similar activities throughout the city and inspired emulation. But whereas Carson's was bottom-up, led by her and other women who succeeded in obtaining governmental support, most activities were top-down, city-sponsored, and led by government officials. For example, the New York City Housing Authority began sponsoring a summer garden contest among its 600,000 public housing tenants in 1963. The association of street trees with civic engagement, social work, and activism, as well as with the emancipation and empowerment of women, children, and Black Americans, has precedents that go back to the 19th century. And while I'm unable to go into these here, let me just at least mention that philanthropic tree planting activities geared towards some of the most disenfranchised groups in New York City began with the activities of the 1902 Tenement Shade Tree Committee. To encourage care and prevent vandalism, each of the trees planted by the committee in the tenement districts bore a small emerald sign stating, "This tree is a gift to children." And that should have stopped on the last slide, I'm sorry. Be its friend. So regardless of whether tree planting initiatives were begun as grassroots actions, as in the case of Hattie Carson in the 1960s, Bedford-Stuyvesant, or as public health and social reform, as in the case of the Tenement Shade Tree Committee in the 20th century, the activities ultimately came to be based upon a hybrid of bottom-up and top-down, and of private and public initiatives. Sweet trees occupied a ground in between the private and public spheres, and they created space for the negotiation of power. Landscape design, especially in times of crisis, can be more than an afterthought. It can be a means and method of encouraging both public and private activism in the spirit of civil rights. Thank you very much.